Great pleasure to introduce to you for this final event Tom Beghin, who's well known as both a scholar and a performer. And I would think it fair to say that Tom feels that both of those activities are thoroughly entwined as far as his own professional life goes. His research interests center on performing practice of the 18th century, representations of gender, music and society, instruments of the 18th and early 19th century. He's the co-editor of a wonderful group of essays on Haydn and the performance of Rhetoric, a fine collection published by a very fine press, University of Chicago Press, and very well received, and also a large number of journal and collection articles. As a performer, Tom has appeared as a soloist, as a vocal accompanist, as a chamber musician. He's recorded for a multitude of labels in Europe and in North America. And tonight's project is, tonight's talk is about a major concern and a research issue of his for the past few years, the recording of Haydn's piano sonatas in an ambience that replicates the ambience of their original performing spaces. And in this he was assisted by Professors Wieslaw Woszczyk and Professor Martha De Francisco. The DVD is out now, and I'm happy to announce that it has been nominated for a Juno Award. So without further ado, please welcome Tom Beghin.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk about the Virtual Haydn. The Virtual Haydn has been the title of an actual product for the last year and a half now, a boxed set of 4 Blu-ray discs, and it makes it easier but also more difficult to talk about this tonight, especially after the previous keynote presentation. I feel quite self-conscious about this because so many decisions have gone into this, not just by myself, but by a team of people. Easier because, well, I get to give a director's commentary, so to speak, over my own live performances. So, I mean, this is the live component, and we're going to look at performances on screen. I'd like to start by immediately playing 3 excerpts. What you see here is the menu page of the second Blu-ray disc. It's we call it a pure audio disc, but there's still lots to see. So let's go to program 7. Okay, let's switch to a different program. Sorry to interrupt. My first point is pragmatic. You're looking at the contents of about 4 hours of music, 5-channel high-resolution surround and 2-channel high-resolution stereo, amounting to 3 different opus sets of Haydn, of 6 sonatas each. The concept of an opus, 3 symphonies, 6 sonatas, 12 songs, etc., was part and parcel of 18th century musical life, both on the publishing and the performing end of things. In 1784, the Viennese publisher Johann Treek announced to the families and individuals of this city, who entertained themselves every week with academian concerts, his intent to make available from his nice stock of the best and newest scores either 3 symphonies or 6 quintets, 6 quartets, 6 trios, etc., at a blanket rental fee of 3 guilders per season. If you played the piano, which in most cases meant that you were an affluent lady, you would have purchased your own score. But the point here has to do more with what was considered the standard attention span, whether spending an evening playing quartets with friends or performing a set of 6 keyboard sonatas for interested guests. Mozart, for instance, frequently performed all his 6 Munich sonatas at private houses in various German cities. Haydn, as we know, performed his 3 Marie Esterházy sonatas during an entertaining hour for a certain Father Rettensteiner. This priest writes that in his score. That's why we know Joseph Haydn played these sonatas for me during an entertaining hour. Before we found Blu-ray, or rather before Blu-ray found us, I seriously struggled with the dilemma of either having to give up the option of fitting a complete opus on a 72-minute disc and continue favoring, as 19th and 20th century practice wants it, single works, or having to compromise on taking repeats to speed things up. But taking repeats, again according to 18th century practice, allows me to improvise over the written text, a skill I was keen to demonstrate also in recording. It is believed, by the way, still on the topic of opus, that Beethoven might have conceived of his 3 last piano sonatas, his quote-unquote 109, 110, 111, as a single opus of 3, as in publishing the 3 earlier opus 31 sonatas, for instance. But by the 1820s, we witness a shift towards a new ideology of the single work. 40 years earlier, in 1780, Haydn, or more to the point, his publisher Artaria would have considered the publication of a single sonata strange, perhaps pretentious, but certainly unmarketable. Now, let's look at Auenbrugger's set. Which is the longest of the 3 opuses here. You get a clear presentation of a collection of 18 pieces, and I say pieces on purpose because Haydn referred to movements of sonatas or symphonies as pieces or Stücke, rather than movements. The track numbers actually don't mean anything anymore in this manual display. In any case, but in hindsight, of course, I would have preferred to have the numbers 8 to 18 rather than 39 through 56, but somehow I myself, when we were making these decisions, I was stuck in the old paradigm of continuous track numberings on CDs. On a conceptual level, Blu-ray started to unlock certain useful ways for me as a performer and author of dealing with what music industry and scholarship has come to refer to as a repertoire. In this case, Haydn's solo keyboard music. A repertoire that, if one gets down to it, if one starts asking pertinent historical questions, actually resists behaving like one. And that this is a good thing, it resisting behaving like one, is something I hope to demonstrate through the course of this lecture. I would now like to switch to PowerPoint, if I may. Can we switch over to PowerPoint? Yeah. All right. So I have the following parts in mind. A quick introduction into the principle of virtual acoustics, which defined more than just the sound technical side of our project. Then a review of the historical components we worked with, instruments, rooms, combining into socio-cultural contexts. Then an example of how thinking about acoustics informs the story of two versions of a sonata, an English versus a Viennese version. And to conclude, I'd like to show an excerpt from the Making Of documentary, which is a feature-length movie in its own right, with its own title of Playing the Room. Here you see an original 1798 Longman Clementi and Company piano in the Holywell Music Room in Oxford, Europe's oldest concert hall. The piece I'm about to play is Haydn's new grand sonata, now known as his number 52, written for the London-based professionally trained pianist Theresa Janssen. We now replace the instrument by an array of speakers chosen to radiate sound in all possible directions and start measuring the room acoustically. Many acoustical snapshots are taken in 8 channels in various positions in the room, low and high, close and far away. And then back here, we replicate everything. You see me sitting at a 2004 replica of the exact same piano of before in a 3-dimensional dome of 24 loudspeakers. Microphones pick up the sounds of the piano, and after a so-called process of convolution, which we heard about in the previous lecture, reverberation responses identical to those in Oxford are sent back through the speakers almost instantaneously. It is as if I'm playing in the Holywell Music Room. When my colleague Wieslaw Woszczyk initially proposed to apply virtual acoustics to, as he still calls it, the Haydn project, I was excited, of course, but the challenges also dawned on me. First, there's the selection of rooms, which ones to choose for a repertoire that revolve for 99% around private music making. The example I just gave, that of a concert sonata in a concert space, is actually the big exception. Even granted that we know which room we'd like, and if it still exists, how authentic is its present state. Second, I'd always assumed that I would go elsewhere to record, to wherever I would find the appropriate instrument. With this new dimension, we had to bring instruments to Montreal, paradoxically turning the virtual much more logistically complex than the real. But we rose to the occasion, and we had a few instruments built, especially for the project. This is a world premiere, the first replica of a mid-18th century Viennese harpsichord. And you see a detailed photo on the left of the idiomatic Viennese short octave, or multiple broken octave. A number of keys in the bass are cut in 2, one even in 3, to accommodate more notes in a shorter span. There are 4 of Haydn's solo keyboard pieces that can be played only on an instrument with this feature. And here's one example. So look at my left hand for the second chord, where I play a D, another D 1 octave higher, like this, and then an F sharp on top of it. The expressive dramatic power of this big Saxon-style clavichord lends itself well for what have been called Haydn's workshop sonatas, of which the C minor sonata is the most famous. By default, because of its long octave that is regularly chromatic, but regularly in the modern sense then, I chose the clavichord for those pieces up to the early 1770s that cannot be played with a short octave. With these organological variables, decisions started revealing themselves. For instance, if you look at the second system, last bar, where the asterisk is, there's this strange jump in the bass. It really doesn't make sense. But then, if you compare it to the actual diagram of a short octave, well, there is no D sharp or E flat in the bass, so Haydn would have had to jump. However strange it looks and feels to our modern eyes or hands. With these organological, so the case is closed. I play the piece, and this is from an A flat sonata number 46 on the 1755 Lydecker. Viennese harpsichords had only one manual with two 8-foot registers, very much like their Italian counterparts. The question of whether a double manual French-style harpsichord is needed at all for Haydn has been open to debate. For the set of sonatas dedicated to Prince Nicolaus Esterházy, however, conceived in an elevated chord-like style, I follow the suggestion of A. Peter Brown, who argues that the prince's French taste, evident in the construction of Esterházy in imitation of Versailles, surely resulted in the purchase of a few French harpsichords too. And incidentally, this opus does require a fully chromatic or French octave, as it was called in Vienna, interestingly, as well as a full 5-octave range, and occasionally does benefit from a two-manual setup, as in this excerpt, an intricate canon between left and right hands from the 5th sonata, and look especially at the second system, the two first measures, which are difficult to play if you only had one manual, because the hands would be playing like this. More and more, Haydn scholarship is coming to terms, and I'm weighing my words, with the fact that the piano that Haydn purchased for himself in 1788 from Wenzel Schans was most probably, or almost certainly, a square. Perhaps more to the point, this type was a domestic keyboard instrument par excellence for women in the later 18th century. And this particular instrument is the second modern-day replica. The other of the same model is now in the Technisches Museum in Vienna. I've seen it, and unfortunately, it's not really in playable condition. A second absolute world premiere. This instrument is a replica of Mozart's Anton Walter piano, not in its present state, but in response to findings that Walter seriously revised or modernized the instrument after Mozart's death, in its original state of 1782, with a so-called Stoß action and with hand stops, left and right, to raise the damper block. Chris Mahne, the maker of this instrument, also built a second action, a prellmechanik, identical to the modernized version, to go in one and the same instrument, and this resulted in number 6. It's the same instrument as number 5, but with a different action, and with added knee levers to operate the dampers. So this is the precursor of the modern-day pedal. And just to make sure that you understand that it's the same piano we're talking about with two actions. So finally, this English piano, which would be very similar, if not identical, to the now lost Longman and Broadrib grant that was shipped from London to Haydn's new house in Gumpendorf, which is a suburb of Vienna, in 1795. This is after his two London trips. And the reason why Longman and Broadrib sent him his piano is an interesting story in itself, most likely to bind him to the company to keep producing works that would be playable on English pianos and marketable to the English market. How to cast these various instruments in appropriate rooms and to connect room and instrument with appropriate repertoire. After scouting locations in Vienna, Eisenstadt, Esterházy, and England, following Haydn's footsteps, but also keeping in mind the broader picture of potential players of his sonatas, we came up with 10 programs. Inspiration for our first program, Courting Nobility, came from the well-known Thé à l'Anglaise painting depicting the young Mozart at the Prince de Contis. You may see that the lid of the harpsichord has been removed. People enjoy their tea, gather around the musicians. The dimensions of this Salon des Quatre Glaces, especially the very high ceiling, reminded us of the music room of Esterházy, which is the one we ended up using. Quality time in room 5 of Haydn's house in Eisenstadt, and I call it room 5 because of the museum's floor plan these days. But when Haydn owned the house, this particular room had probably not yet been incorporated in his living quarters, but we use it nonetheless, but we're using it as a typical middle class type of room with a low ceiling. And we draw inspiration from the following engraving. Note the intense listening by one man seated at what may be described in sound recording terms as the perfect clavichord listening spot, or the sweet spot, say, of the room. The listening perspective in this program is that of the teacher. We've imagined an aristocratic pupil, a countess or a princess, and have cast this music lesson in a salon of the Esterházy Palace in Eisenstadt, but again in a generic way, not necessarily Haydn specific. Then program 4 with the famous C minor sonata at the end. This is the second room we're using from Haydn's own house, and now we are using it as a Haydn room. This would have been his living room. It has the same dimensions as the adjacent room, which would have been his study. We chose this because it just was easier to work in. The other one now functions as an office. For microphone placement, we drew inspiration from the Guttenbrunn portrait of Haydn at the keyboard. Clavichord or square piano, one can't really tell. Again, it would take me too far to elaborate on this. Motto of the program is Haydn's own description of his compositional process. I sat down at the clavier, at the clavichord, began to improvise. Fantasieren is the term he uses, depending on whether my mood was sad or happy, serious or playful. The idea here is to improvise, to play for oneself. So the player is also the one and only listener. And Marta de Francisco actually mic'd it in such, from this kind of perspective, which was kind of strange for me when I listened to the results afterwards, because I recognized it immediately when we were doing the recording. Yeah, that's what I want. When I heard myself in the listener seat afterwards in the mixing stage, I said, maybe the other position would have been better. But it's interesting to have these, to have a variety. Here we couldn't resist the temptation to use the magnificent Esterházy ceremonial room. After all, this was Haydn's first official print, dedicated in all splendor to his own prince, Niccolò Esterházy di Galanta. Here we see a portrait of the prince. Program 6, the score. This set was first published by Hummel in Amsterdam without Haydn's official consent. To give testimony of the increasing dissemination of Haydn's sonatas, we wanted to find a faraway location. And why not? Right here in Quebec, the 18th century Chateau Ramezay, the French and later the British governor's residence. This is the room, quite beautiful. We're back in Vienna, now for a special performance by the two Auenbrugger sisters on a grand forte piano. And again in this image, which has nothing to do with the Auenbrugger sisters, by the way, it's a French image. But again, notice the absence of a lid of the piano. Compare the title page of these sonatas. Haydn wrote them as a wedding gift for the young princess Maria Esterházy, with the golden ornaments on the 1788 Injas Kober Square, or the beautiful restored silk fabric on the walls of an Albertina Prunkraum, we're recreating a splendid but intimate performance context. The princess reading Haydn's musical letters aloud, governess, music teacher, or mother-in-law by her side. Finding an actual Viennese salon was a great challenge, and the breakthrough came after deciding to also play what I call, and what I'll elaborate on later in this lecture, what I call the Viennese version of the big E-flat sonata, number 52, rededicated here to Mademoiselle Madeleine de Kurzbeck, Magdalena von Kurzbeck. I actually mentioned the publisher Kurzbeck before in a previous set. She's the daughter of the publisher. We now felt justified to invite ourselves to the impressive Lobkowitz Festsaal, now also known as the Eroica Saal, because Beethoven's Eroica was premiered there, which was a popular, albeit exclusive venue for performances in the mid to late 1790s. And finally, back to the beginning of my presentation, which shows the Holywell Music Room as an alternative for the non-extant Hanover Square rooms, where it was accepted practice for the pianist soloist to replace the component of a piano concerto with a grand solo piano sonata. I mean, it's this context of, this permission to use a solo sonata in concert as part, in between an ouverture and an aria and orchestral productions, that gave birth to the concept of a grand concert sonata. So here you have an overview, 10 programs, 10 windows, and 2 different types of musicking, to borrow a term that was coined by ethnomusicologist Christopher Small to replace the noun music. Now you're probably curious to hear virtual acoustics at work, so here's a small sample from program 5. You see me sitting in a chair where His Most Serene Highness might have sat, and we first listened to a dry rendition, that's to say one that has been recorded in the lab, of direct sounds coming out of the instrument, though as I performed I could hear the virtual room through headphones, as you see in the picture above. And then we'll compare with the wet version, that is the mixing of this excerpt in the virtual room, and here, in this case, the ceremonial hall of Esterhazy. And I invite you to listen especially to the timing of the final notes of my phrase. So first, dry. The bump you heard it's PowerPoint related. It's not the file, but I think you got the picture. So let's compare with the wet version. During the period of recording, because so many interests were represented, virtual acoustic research, almost developing the technology as we went along, sound recording and producing, attendance to the instruments, etc., there was almost no room for error. So in a sense, as a designated historian, I had to trust the premise that if it worked for them being Haydn and his players, then it should work for me too. It here referring to the amalgam of decisions that I had taken, trying to match rooms with instruments. It was only afterwards, and most clearly during the final mixing stage, which itself took several months to complete, that we were in a position to rationalize some of these decisions. But this, of course, is the value of this kind of research, that one can isolate and objectify the different parameters. And this brings me to my third part, where I've actually asked myself, well, as an historian, as a performer, somebody who's interested in playing on these historical instruments, what has this exercise of bringing acoustics in the mix taught me? How can I look at these scores differently now? As I already indicated, we recorded the big Haydn E-flat sonata twice. Once in its English manifestation, reading from the 1799 Longman Clementi and Company print, on a replica of a Longman Clementi and Company piano in the Holywell Music Room. And the second time, playing of the 1798 Artaria print on a Walter Forte piano in the Lobkowitz Festsaal. The dates need some explaining. So 1998, Haydn wrote a piece for Theresa Janssen back in 1794, but she had it published in London only years later in 1799. But the English print does reflect the origin of context, the context of origin. Sorry. It's interesting that Theresa Janssen sat on this piece for so many years before publishing it, but it seems plausible that she wished to perform it exclusively during her own concerts, and then noticed when Haydn had published it that she should rush to get her edition out too, hence the later date. The rededication of this particular sonata from Janssen to Kurzbach begs the question whether we should think of the Viennese publication as a second version, so to speak, or whether in some way in 1798 we are witnessing the birth of the work concept in the post-1800 Lydia-Gurian sense. The score of this particular sonata gaining independence from actual people, instruments, or rooms. Here are the four major sources for the piece. So A, autograph, also incidentally the A for autograph, has been established by Haydn scholarship as the best source. And D, the Breitkopf Œuvre Complète, is the historical edition considered most removed from A. My comparative exercise becomes London on the one hand and Vienna on the other, thus making the Artaria print a valid counterpart of the London edition, contrary to traditional Haydn philology, which has never taken the Viennese print seriously. Maybe I should clarify the subtext here. We're really talking about two different kinds of piano building in these two centers. And to republish a piece that has been designed not just for that particular instrument, but also for a certain social setting of a concert performance, to republish it and rededicate it in a different city is problematic at best. Let me start with an example from the manuscript. Coming at the end of his page, Haydn leaves a portion of the stave blank, carefully controlling the moment of the page turn in the middle of a rhetorical suspensio, keeping suspense. This is one of four such examples in the whole piece, and each of those moments has been honored in the Artaria print, mainly thanks to its oblong format, contrary to the layout of the Longman edition, which seems less concerned with the rhetorical effect of the performer herself turning the page visually for the listener to see, either anticipating the presence of a page turner or a more practiced, partially or perhaps wholly memorized performance, playing without the score. Going back 7 bars in the English edition, we see in the left hand the typical English wiggly legato slur, and I wished I had this laser pointer, which I don't think I have here, but it's in the first bar. Yeah, you can't. Oh, it's a bad projection. In the left hand. What can I do? Oh yeah, that's true. Oh yeah, good idea. Over here. I mean, I call it wiggly. This is typical English, and you would often see them cross bar lines for longer stretches. The English piano's pushing action, the softer hammer ladder, the more resonant afterring enhanced by English feather duster dampers, all these contribute to a sense of mystery or mistiness that the piano hangs on to. I'm sorry, I made a mistake here. I should have let me take a second here to realize what I'm doing. Yeah. Okay, this is the passage I'm talking about. Yes, it's the same passage. You see it, the second excerpt here. So this is the bar I was pointing out before. So all these characteristics contribute to a sense of mystery or mistiness that the pianist hangs on to after arriving on the low dominant over here. Changing from minore, D flat, to maggiore, the natural, only through the middle of the bar, before the upward sweep to an enthusiastically exclamatory version of the theme. Now let's listen to this on the Longman Clementi piano, so on the English piano. Now compare this to the Artaria print. And now I'm looking at this bar. This is the bar we're looking at. So no wiggly legato, but a clear Viennese slur. Over 3 notes, the augmented second from A to G flat in the bass, distinctly separated, turning the dominant in the next bar into a more conscious point of arrival, accompanied at that very moment, and this is really the striking thing, by a change of minore to maggiore. You see the D natural here. So half a bar sooner than in the English print. Now this has been dismissed, it's a bad source, so we don't pay attention to this. But my exercise here, well, let's pay attention to this and let's connect it to the instrument we're playing it on. From the perspective of the Viennese piano, with its harsher ladder, more precise action, more precise dampers, insistence on clarity in every register, including the bass, this double change makes a lot of sense. I've tried many times from my longer experience of playing the piece on an English instrument to integrate that low G-flat bass octave, and the augmented interval before within one overall cloud of sound, but on a Viennese piano, it's hard to soften the generally more distinct attacks. It's hard to treat your knee lever as a more distant foot pedal. So why not articulate the moment? Let's now listen to the Viennese rendition. These are subtle points. I hope you picked up on it. The thick opening chords of number 52 are well known. A single arpeggiated opening chord is not uncommon. Here's one from a Haydn piano trio. But here, the entire theme consists of arpeggiated thick chords. There are 7 of them in a row. Jam, cham, chatam. I should count. Jam, tam, tatam, tiradam, padim, tadam. The theme is, in Katalin Komlosch's words, Haydn's most robust construction for a keyboard instrument. In her analysis, Y. Ellenbrook evokes the topic of entrée, a refinement of Leonard Ratner's March. And Haydn's use isn't new either. Here's an earlier example, Yam pidam pidim tiram padam from with the idiomatic dotted rhythms from the opening of the Prince Nicholas Esterhazy sonatas. But the architectural context for the E-flat sonata, the English E-flat sonata, is not the chords, but, as I would propose, the arena of public speaking. To witness public speaking in London would have been new to Haydn. William Pitt, here depicted in full action at the House of Commons, was present at the big luncheon in honor of the Lord Mayor in November of 1791, an event that Haydn was invited to as well. No toast, Haydn writes in his notebook, was more applauded than that of Mr. Pitt. So rather than an entrée, I propose to see in those opening chords with its emerging melodic content, yam, yam, ta-dam, the equivalent to the act of rising to speak. Sir, I rise to propose a reform in the parliamentary representation of the people. The honorable gentleman in this contemporary example is Mr. Flood. But I'm told this is not the time. And why? Because forsooth there are disturbances in France. We're in March 1790, not too long before Haydn's first trip to England. The interjection, and why, is a rhetorical figure of address, here part of a mock dialogue with the audience, question and answer given by the orator himself. Similar figures of address are present also in this Haydn theme, and I refer to bars 3 to 5 with their embellished version of the A-flat G motive. Ti-da-dee-da-dum, ti-dee-da-dum, ti-dee-da-dum, ya-da-da-da, and then it continues. But from an instrument technological point of view, how English are these? Let's listen to the theme again on the Longman Clementi piano without added reverb, so without any room, and listen especially to the resonance after each pause, so a lingering desire to connect both with the audience out there and with the overall flow of one's expressed ideas. So again, we're in there's no acoustics. We're in a dry, absorptive lab, so we're listening to the instrument itself. And now the same on the Viennese piano. And it's getting hard now to do this exercise because we've heard the theme a few times, so don't fill in the gaps, just listen. Just listen to the music, don't fill in the silences. We lost coherence. During the first two bars, the arpeggio marks, many more by the way, you see them here, many more arpeggio marks than in the English print, as if to compensate for something that isn't there in the instrument, still reminded me of lending weight to each of my chords, but the ensuing piano interjections, though intellectually still connected with the material of bar 2, fail to have the same argumentative impact. The Viennese piano does better with something like this, a self-reflective kind of declamation starting from something full, with lots of impact, but where the decay of sounds takes over the expression until it is the silence itself that speaks. To go back to Sonata 52, Haydn surely was aware of all this. If he adjusted to circumstances in London, a hypothesis so clearly confirmed by the evidence, then he must also have acknowledged the difficulties in appropriating the new results to the old circumstances of Vienna. The main adjustment, however, Haydn's most important decision, may have been not in adjusting some details of notation, but in the rededication of the score. The reviewer of the German Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, oblivious of the English roots of the work, makes note of, quote, the lady mentioned on the title page, Magdalena von Kurzbeck. The dedication is said to speak well for her, quote, because Haydn does not have the desire nor the time to give empty compliments. But Haydn may have needed Kurzbeck more than the German reviewer could know, just as Haydn had needed Theresa Janssen to coach him on how to write an English grand sonata. Kurzbeck, like Janssen, was in her mid-20s. Like Janssen in London, she was a rising star on the Viennese scene. For his grand sonata to survive also in the Viennese salon, Haydn may have counted on Magdalena's chances to actually be invited to play in grand and formal acoustics, such as the one in the Lobkowitz Festsaal. So here's the opening of the sonata again, the Viennese version, now in the Lobkowitz Virtual Acoustics. And as you listen and watch the room, imagine those silent moments of connecting with a public. If I can rephrase my argument here, it would be to say that what Haydn would lack in terms of instrument, he has to make up for in terms of bringing it out in the public exposure and having it performed in grand acoustics, formal acoustics like this, where the acoustics provide the kind of reverberation that the English piano has by itself. Okay, I'd now like to switch to the Blu-ray player again, to disc 4, to a specific moment in the video documentary. And I'm presenting this excerpt as a way of conclusion, so after that I'd like to open the floor for questions, and my two collaborators, Marta De Francisco and Wieslaw Woszczyk, are here as well, so hopefully they'll help me in answering any questions that may come up. So we look at well, yes, let me give me a moment to figure it out. It's all new to me too, the pop-up menu stuff. And let's see. Oh, sorry. Oh, I can see. Come on.
In September 1783, there was a big wedding at Esterházy between Princess Marie Hermenegild Esterházy, or I should say her maiden name is Liechtenstein, von Liechtenstein, with Nikolaus Esterházy. He was the grandson of the other Nikolaus, and he would later become Nikolaus II. Now, Marie Esterházy was 15, which wasn't really that uncommon at the time to get married so young. And Nikolaus, her husband, was 17. Now, Haydn, a few months later, publishes 3 special sonatas, precious sonatas, small scale at just 2 movements each. And he dedicates these to Marie Esterházy. princess. And we believe that Haydn wrote these pieces and published them as a kind of a wedding gift. There was a time when I was really curious to get to know more about the personality of Marie Esterházy. And my thinking was that if I would find things about her, letters, documents, anything, that I would understand her personality better, and therefore I would understand the pieces that Haydn wrote for her better. So I went to the Esterházy archives in Budapest. There's piles of letters of Marie Esterházy. And fortunately for me, none of them from the time when she was 15, which was a time I was interested in. But I focused on letters that she wrote to her dear friend, the Empress, Maria Beatrix Ludovica, in Vienna, about arranging the marriage of her own son, Paul. And I thought, well, this is great. If I get to read about what she expects her own daughter-in-law, what kind of person she wants her to be, I'll get to learn something about the kinds of pressures that were put on her when she was getting married. But then as I was reading through the one after the other letter, I started to realize that just the language itself, the way that she wrote these letters, are so similar to the way Haydn writes these sonatas. And then I started also reading Haydn's letters to women, in particular the letter that he wrote to his dear friend Frau von Genzinger. And I find the same kind of rhetoric. It's a very spontaneous, non-syntactical kind of writing. It's all underemphasized. It's all implicit. It's just. There's no clear goal. There's no clear syntax. There's no clear punctuation points. It just happens, spontaneous, very sensitive. And then, after that first movement in Haydn's piece, but also in the letters, there is this sudden shift. And then we have a fast second movement, a very fast, witty, capricious finale. Same thing in these letters. First it's about, oh, I miss you, and it was such a pleasure to see you from a distance last night at the theater. And all of a sudden she says, oh, it was a fun party last night, and we gossiped about this, and did you know that this friend is having an affair with, and it's very gossipy, very informative. Second part of the letter, which is much shorter than the first. Exactly the same proportions as in these pieces, with no logical connection between the two parts. So this is an instance where it really pays off to learn about how people communicated with one another in these days. It's not just about music. It's about live communication, behavior, etiquette, what's expected, private, what's expected from you in public circumstances. And all these things show in Haydn's music.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for putting these machines, 18th century machines, in such a rich context, economic context, context of patronage, context of audiences, context of buildings. Questions? Catherine?
Two questions. The one, a very technical thing. When you were trying to work on the acoustics of the room or whatever, I'm curious about, I'm sure you've been asked this a zillion times, but about taking into account how the room would work with people in the room, so the spaces. At one point you said, you know, imagine this sound as the audience would hear. So that's a sort of very physical, technical question. And then my second question is about yourself as an artist, whatever that means exactly, but let's take it with a sort of expressive connotation, the idea that there's something from you coming in as a performer. And I'm curious to know how that intersects with your historical project. So for example, with the Princess, do you see yourself as an actor in terms of, you know, I know as both a historian and a performer, are you trying to try, I mean, you know, just are you trying to sort of, are you taking on an acting kind of role to try and get inside of her? Or is there a conflict between your own artistic sensibilities and how you perceive that she might have wanted, and how those work together?
Well, I guess the answer is that it's very complex and it causes all kinds of existential crises. But this particular problem interests me very much indeed, is to position myself in that triangle, so to speak, between composer, dedicatee, and myself. I mean, the first step there is that I have to establish that there indeed is a connection between the rhetoric of, in this case, Haydn, and the fact that he addresses it to the one or the other user. Or class of users. It doesn't have to be a specific person. It can be that person as a representative of a certain type of player. And I think in Haydn's case, that's a case that can be made quite convincingly, in my opinion. But then you must ask the question, indeed, well, where do I position myself? As a modern trained professional who's playing these pieces that were, you know, if you come down to it, were not really meant to be played by me. And how can you transfer this realization into something that maybe transforms the context, say, of Marie Esterhazy or Frau von Gensinger sight reading these pieces into something that speaks to audiences today? One of the decisions we made in this recording project is, and I think it would be, I think in that sense we're also breaking new ground. I think in recording in this way, I don't know, but there are instances where we give alternative versions of a certain movement. For instance, there's this minuet where Haydn asks you to play al rovescio. So he asks you to play, as the repeats of the minuet, he asks you to play the minuet backwards. Now, the original edition does not include the solution, the historical edition, but all modern editions do. So most modern piano students are not aware of the problem that would have been, you know, that would have been imposed on you. It's like a riddle that you're supposed to solve. Now, on the disc we included a side-read version where I pretend to be side-reading it backwards with, you know, the appropriate hesitation and stuff. And we also produced a learned version, where I call it the learned version in the sense that it's one that I've practiced, and where I try to outsmart Haydn, so to speak. You know, you have to imagine that Haydn is playing a trick on this poor performer, poor, you know, quote unquote, in a very joking kind of way. But if you try to outsmart him, you know, you could play ornamentation, for instance, in the second version, and then you can play the ornamentation backwards. So I mean, you can play with these levels. But I think it's important to explore both of them. And indeed, as you say, I think you're quite. Yes, you're very much on it. I think is that to some degree it's about acting indeed. And then it's not, you know. Yeah. The first question though that you asked about having people in the room. It's a question that during presentations we've been receiving very often. The focus of this project was, and I think I can answer also on behalf of Wieslaw, the focus of this project was to get away of the idea of one concert hall. So the one concert hall fits all, in the same way as we're going away from the idea of one piano fits all. So the fact that we have a variety in itself is a big step that we've taken. Another project indeed could be to now look at one specific room and fill it up with, you know, different sizes of audiences. But there I must say that the majority of the programs that we've done, the point that they're trying to make exactly is that we are in this day and age, overemphasizing the presence of a public, of an audience. I mean, if you're talking about Haydn improvising at the clavichord, well, basically the room would probably have been exactly the same as we found it now, with some furniture and instrument here, and that would be it. Or imagine playing a square piano with just one person listening next to you. I mean, basically you're playing for yourself. The question poses itself more in a program like the Sonatas for the Prince, if he ever did perform them for the Prince. I mean, if you were even willing to contemplate this kind of historical reconstruction scenario, then what do? Do you imagine the Prince? With how many people would he have sat there? What kind of clothes would they have worn? And it's fun, but we decided to not make things more complex as they were. Plus, in the end, we're not really interested in the historical reconstruction part of it. And that's the reason why we did lots of things in the mixing stage. I mean, in the end, it's still a sound recording project that should be convincing on its own terms, regardless of all of these historical scenarios. So in terms of absorption, for instance, there's a lot you can do. You know, just tweaking with mixing. So I guess what I'm saying is that in this case, do you really need to go in there and sample the room in different states of absorption? Well, if you can do a similar effect but now I'm really answering way out of my league. Maybe Martha or Wieslaw should pick up on this.
When we make recordings like CD projects, we also go to an empty hall. We don't go to a hall where there are 200 people sitting there absorbing all the high frequencies, but we let it sound where it sounds best without interruptions of the flow of the reflections in the room.
Yeah, but no, I would find it fascinating to do a project, say, with chamber music that involves audience behavior, where you would, in sound recording, say you have a more fluid type of listening, where people would actually be circled, would be walking around in a room, circling around the string quartet that's playing around a circular table, as we have those string quartet stands of the time, and to hear this. But then you'd need the visual element too. You'd need to have a video component. Otherwise, as a listener, you don't know what's happening. You need some context. But this would be fascinating indeed. Yeah, that's the next level.
Another question. Yes? Just to kind of clarify on what you just answered. So this project is basically like if you're going to a time machine and recording as we do now, but using the equipment and the spaces of the time, with the modern conveniences of not having to go there.
Well, the historical dimension is just because of me, because I happen to be a historical performer. But you could do this kind of exercise with anything, with any music programming, with any hall. So the idea, I guess, in the end would be to indeed come up with a database of some sort where you could select your hall. And I must stress, I mean, I'm again speaking out of my league, but different to other projects of convolution, what we're doing here is creating a technology or a forum where you can use convolution and yet perform live. So I get to react to the convoluted sounds immediately as I play. Well, with a delay of 1/10 of a millisecond. So that's the example that I showed with the dry and the wet. It's important that I understand that this is something that became clear in the mixing stage, it's only then that I understood what I was trying to do in the recording studio with my headphones on. Oh, okay, now it makes sense. Now I understand the timing. Before, I didn't quite understand what I was doing as a musician. Yeah.
One thing that really, I would say, surprised me is the very thick sense that you give to the idea of a dedication. So that you're using the idea of dedication really to help inform the meaning of the work. It's been written for this person, for this room, and this explains the kind of performance choices that we need to make sense of it, connecting it in an incredibly thick way. And I must say, just as a remark, I had never thought about dedication with that thickness. I had thought about it as a much thinner, important a gesture of patronage or whatever.
Yes.
But I suppose I had always thought that for composers, even in Haydn's time, their compositional technique was directed not just to this particular moment, this particular hall, but to broader intellectual and social publics, to different times, to a future and a past. So what evidence do we have that this thick idea of dedication really corresponded to Haydn's compositional practice?
It's a very good question. What we're witnessing here is really at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, is a shift in thinking about these things. I must say, the way I apply it really works well in this specific repertoire. Music written for mostly female players, amateur players, people that have a certain significance in Haydn's life. Sometimes it's people that he knew, sometimes they represent a certain type of player he's trying to provide music for. There is this famous letter of Haydn writing his after writing his Applauses cantata for some ceremony of ordaining of a priest somewhere else, and he says that not knowing the place nor the circumstances made the work on this cantata sour for me. That's one instance. There's a different letter where he's asked by his prince to send out scores of 2 of his masses to a friend of the prince who is far away. It was a letter coming from Pressburg. And Haydn politely refuses. He says, I don't want to do this because if I'm not there to direct it myself, I cannot be in control of the value of the piece anymore. So there's a very strong connection in Haydn's mind between the way he operates as a composer and as a performer. He'd like to be there. He'd like to adjust his work to circumstances. Now, if you compare that with, it's a large topic, and it has to do with listening to music from a rhetorical point of view, as opposed to there's this book of Mark Evan Bonds about listening to music from a philosophical point of view, which is something that happens with Beethoven, and this is the way that Hofmann starts talking about listening to Beethoven symphonies. It's not about the composer doing things anymore, but it's about that work, that symphony, doing things to the listener. And if you don't understand what he does, you better listen to us critics to explain to you what's happening. But the topic of dedication. If you think of Beethoven, you're absolutely right. It would be much harder for me to make these kinds of claims. Incidentally, there's going to be a conference devoted exactly to this subject at the Beethoven House in October, in the end of September, in conjunction with the Haydn Institute. So it will be interesting to work on this topic and see exactly how it plays out differently for a composer like Haydn versus somebody like Beethoven.
Maybe one final question. Yes.
I was wondering, did you happen to play any instrument other than the forte pianos that you were working on during this recording project? And also, did you happen to be listening to any other types of music, or were you completely immersed in terms of playing and listening to this time period during the course of the project?
I'm trying to understand the question.
Did you listen to anything other than the music of Haydn And did you play any music or did you play any instruments other than the instruments that Haydn played during this recording project?
Specifically during the recording?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
I mean, this has been a project that's been long in the making. I've done smaller projects along the way, of course, doing other projects and playing different kinds of pianos, yes. But I guess your question, it is true that for this particular project, for instance, I would not necessarily be interested in what my colleagues have done. I'd be much more interested indeed to get to know the personality of someone like Marie Esterhazy and read her letter, and just it's another way. It's another approach to things. So I see the positive. I think that's what you're hinting at.
Right. I mean, I don't know what it was going to be yes or no, and what Ed was going to.
Well, there's no yes or no.
I mean, that's part of what we do, isn't it? We spend time on a project and we get immersed in it, but it doesn't take us away from other things at the same time. So I've been playing concerts on 19th century pianos at the same time, and doing recording projects as well.
And did you find playing on these different types of instruments to sort of cross-pollinate the experience, did you feel like they were distracting and they were in separate realms in your mind and in your ear? And
I think the trick is to get away from the modern notion that you spend time on one single instrument and that you're an instrumentalist and it is fixed, what type of instrument it is. It's true that the 18th century concept of a keyboardist would be much more versatile. C.P. Bach himself, 1753, advises every child, every aspiring keyboardist to practice both on a clavichord and a harpsichord. And after a while you develop this flexibility and this versatility, and you find that experiences on one or the other instrument help you for the other one. But it's more you have to get away from that idea of that you must well, it's a paradox, isn't it? Because I mean, if there's one specialist, it would be me. But at the same time, it opens up. It makes the world you're absorbed in so much richer too. So indeed, I mean, we're talking about a 50-year period here, but there were so many different kinds of keyboard instruments, and the 7 that I showed we could have included others, I'm sure. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thanks,